Now, let us begin the structure and the reproduction in the lichens. As you know, in your UPSC main syllabus in the chapter 2, we have to study the structure and reproduction in the lichens in very detail. Okay. Now, in our previous lecture, we have already introduced ourselves to the structure and the reproduction to the lichens. So, in this particular video lecture, we are going to elaborate these things. Okay, that how the variation in the thallus structure is found in the lichens. In that category we will study the morphological characteristics plus the anatomical characteristics. The anatomical characteristics are more or less same in all the lichens, but the morphological characteristics are differ somewhat. So we are going to see the wide range of the lichens in which the thallus structures is different morphologically, but anatomically they are somewhat similar. Okay, so structure and the reproduction in the lichen will be the today's topic. All right, so this is your syllabus, that is the cryptogams. In that we are studying the lichens, and we have to study the structure and reproduction from the evolutionary point of view. Okay, and that is what we are going to do in this particular video lecture. Now consider the introductory slide, that is the vegetative portion of the lichen is called as the thallus. Okay, whatever the thallus is there, that thallus is called as the vegetative portion. Okay, before going into the reproductive phase, all of the thallus, whatever you see seeing in this particular picture, all this thallus is a vegetative structure. That means before the reproductive phase of this lichen, the whole thallus is considered as a vegetative structure. Okay, now this thallus develops into the morphologically diverse form of the structures like leafy lichens, flat lichens, filamentous lichens, powdery granule like the structures. Okay, that is, these thalluses range from the leafy thallus, flat thallus, filamentous thallus, or sometimes it's the erect thallus, sometimes they show just the powdery granules. So there is a range of the thallus structures in the lichens, because sometimes they look leafy, sometimes they look almost flat, sometimes they look filamentous, sometimes they look the leafy and the erect portion. Okay, so they sometimes they only shows the powdery granules. So there is a whole range of the thalluses which are found in these particular lichens. Okay, hence we divided them into the Foliose lichen, Fruticose lichen, Squamulose lichen, or the Crustose lichen, or the Filamentous lichen. Okay, so depending upon their morphological characteristics. Okay, if you carefully observe the morphological characteristics of all these lichens, we can divide these lichens into morphologically different forms, just like Foliose lichen, Fruticose lichen, Squamulose lichen, Crustose lichen, and the Filamentous lichen. Okay, now whenever the UPSC mains examination asks you about the morphology of the lichen, you should able to mention all these points, because in range of the thalluses morphologically are particularly very different in the lichens, and that is why you should be able to mention all these types. Okay, these types of words, that is Foliose lichen, Fruticose lichen, Squamulose lichen, Crustose lichen, and the Filamentous lichen, should be there to complete your answer. Right, now consider them one by one. See, while their morphological appearance may differ, their inner structure of all the lichens groups is nearly similar. Okay, what we have studied yesterday, that there is upper cortex. Of course, yeah, in this particular diagram you can observe here, this is the upper cortex, and then below the upper cortex we have the algal layers at the junction of the medulla and the upper cortex. Okay, upper cortex and medulla, whenever it's a meeting of the upper cortex and the medulla, at that particular junction we find the algal cells. Okay, so first layer is of the upper cortex, then we have the algal layers, and below we have the medulla, and these medulla are connected with the upper cortex, and at this particular junction we find the particular green alga which can photosynthesize, right? And this is the fungal hyphae, and then we have the lower cortex, and sometimes from this lower cortex the rhizinae are coming out to attach themselves to the substratum. Okay, so in general the morphological characteristics of the lichen may differ from lichen to lichen, but the anatomical features are nearly same. Okay, nearly, because sometimes these anatomical structures do not show the presence of the lower cortex, and sometimes there is a presence of upper as well as the lower cortex. So some kind of difference occurs anatomically, but nearly they shows the similar kind of the anatomical features, right? So rhizinae-like structure or the lower cortex-like structure may differ from lichen to lichen, but the general anatomical features of all the lichens are nearly same. Okay, it contains the number of layers. Yes, of course, we have studied this. It contains the number of layers, that is the upper cortex, lower cortex, hyphae, the green alga, right? The outer cortex is known the outer layer is known as the cortex. Okay, whatever the outer cortex is there, this upper layer is called as the outer cortex, and it is composed of only the fungal cells. Okay, now from UPSC mains examination point of view, when you write down the answer, you should be able to clarify like this, that the upper cortex, because lichen is made up of the 2 to 3 organisms, it may contain the algae with the cyanobacteria as well, because there should be the presence of fungi along with the algae or the cyanobacteria, or sometimes all the three are present in the same thallus. So you carefully have to mention that the upper cortex is only made up of the fungal cells. Okay, so in the upper cortex, whatever cells you are seeing, they does not contain the cells of the algae, but they contain the cells of only fungi. So the upper cortex, whatever the upper cortex is there, these all cells of the upper cortex are belongs to the fungi. and not to the algae. Okay, now below to the cortex layer is the algal layer. Of course, you can see here is the green algal layer, and it is dominated by the algal cells. Of course, you have to mention that the second layer, which is the algal layer or the photoband layer, this layer is composed of the algal cells and not of the fungal cells. Okay, so in the first layer we have the upper cortex, which is primarily made up of the fungal cell. In the second layer, we have the algal cells, which are photosynthetic cell, which is dominated by these particular algal cells, this layer, because some kind of the hyphae is going through this in the form of medulla, but the majority of the cells belongs to the algae, and that is why we say that these algae are dominating this particular area. Okay, now see cells in the matrix of the fungal threads. Of course, the third layer is of the medulla. Of course, you see this is the medulla layer, and this medulla layer is again dominated mostly by the fungal cells. Okay, you can observe here these are mostly the fungal cells. So the upper layer is the cortex layer, below we have the algal layer, and below that we have the medulla layer, which is dominated by the fungal cells. So out of the three layers, the two layers are dominated by the fungal cells, and the middle layer, which is called as the alga layer, is dominated by the photoband partner. Okay, so algal cells are present in the between layer, and the upper portion of the thallus, that is the upper cortex, is dominated by the fungi, and the lower portion, that is the medulla, is also dominated by the fungal cells. Okay, so here you come to know anatomically what we have at the upper layer is the upper cortex dominated by the fungal cells, then we have the algal cells dominated by the photoband cell, and then we have the medulla, which is mostly made up of the fungal cells. Right, now see in the Crustose lichen. Okay, we have studied the Crustose lichen. These are flat lichens, just like this observed in this particular picture. This is the Crustose lichen, and why we are calling them as a Crustose lichen? Because they occurs on the crust. Whatever the rocks are there, they are found in these rocks very firmly attached, and they form a very flat structure. Now observe, like this is the whole lichen which is forming this particular structure on these particular rocks. Okay, now see in the Crustose lichen, the medulla layer is directly connected to the substrate. Very important. See, consider this is the highlighted anatomical feature. This is the outer cortex, then we have the algal layer in which the fungal hyphae and the cortex is connected at the junction of the medulla and the upper cortex. We are here finding the green algal cells, and below that what we have is the medulla layer. Now see, very important point to understand here. Now in the Crustose lichen, when we talk about the Crustose lichen, okay, generally what you see in the diagram below the medulla layer, this is the medulla layer. Now in this particular diagram, what you are saying, below the medulla layer you will find the lower cortex. This portion is called as the lower cortex, right? And below this lower cortex you are also finding the rhizome. Okay, rhizome is also there. But in the Crustose lichen, what is the structure? After the medulla layer, this particular medulla layer is directly connected to the substrate, this medulla layer. That is, in these lichens, if you go from top to the bottom, at the bottom layer, these medulla cells are directly inserted into the rock, that is into the substratum. Above this medulla, what we have the algal cells, and above these algal cells, what we have is the cortex. So in the Crustose lichen, this particular medulla layer is directly connected to the substrate, but in the Foliose and the Fruticose lichens have the another layer which is called as the lower cortex. So this kind of the lower cortex are only present in the Foliose or the Fruticose lichens. Very important. You should be able to differentiate between the Crustose lichen, Foliose lichen, and the Fruticose lichen depending upon their anatomical features. Okay, so the Foliose and the Fruticose lichen contains the extra layer of the cells which is called as the lower cortex, which is attached to the substrate by means of the rhizome, that is the hair-like structures. These rhizomes are also present there. So this makes different the Foliose and the Fruticose lichens from the Crustose lichen. The Crustose lichen, the medulla layer is directly connected to the substratum, because the Crustose lichen shows somewhat simpler structure and they do not possess the lower cortex or the rhizome. What they possess are the fungal cells of the medulla at the last layer, and this medulla layer is directly connected to the substratum. While in the Foliose and the Fruticose lichen, they show some differentiation, they show some advancement in their structure, and that is why they shows the lower cortex plus the rhizome. So from the evolutionary point of view, the Crustose lichens lag behind from the Foliose lichens and the Fruticose lichen, because these Foliose and the Fruticose lichen shows the presence of the extra layers, that is they evolved somewhat as compared to the Crustose lichen, because this Foliose lichen shows the extra structures like the lower cortex or the rhizome. Same is true for the Fruticose lichen. But the Crustose lichen shows only the three layers, that is the upper cortex, middle algal layer, and the medulla region. And this medulla region is directly connected to the substratum, to the rocks. And that is why on the evolutionary line, from the evolutionary point of view, we can say that the Crustose lichens are lacking behind than the Foliose lichen and the Fruticose lichen. Because these Foliose lichen and Fruticose lichens contains extra layer of the lower cortex, plus they has the rhizine from which they used to attach to the substratum. Okay, so very important, you should be able to compare between the Crustose lichen, Foliose lichen and the Fruticose lichens anatomically. That is how they are different. Okay, and on the evolutionary line, the Crustose lichens are lacking behind than the Foliose and the Fruticose lichen. Okay, so very important point. And now consider the next one, that is the Crustose lichen. Now we will going to focus particularly on the Crustose lichens, how they are, what type of structures they show. Okay, now see, the thallus forms the crust over the substrate. Now observe, this is the Crustose lichen which grow on the crust. Okay, earth crust majority of the times are the rocks. Okay, so this particular lichen is growing on this rock. Okay, and as we have discussed just earlier, that the medulla is directly comes in a contact with the substrate. Okay, so it is firmly attached to it, that is it is firmly attached to their crust, and generally this firmness is so strong that even by the human hand you cannot extract this intact particular lichen from the substratum, because the medulla layer is so firmly attached these lichens to the substratum. Okay, there is an presence of the upper cortex, of course, upper cortex which is primarily made up of the fungi cells only. Then they do not have the lower cortex, as we have discussed in the last slide. Okay, this is the Crustose lichen do not find any lower cortex, and the medulla is in direct contact with the substrate and are commonly grow inside to some extent. See, very important, whatever the medulla portion is there, this medulla portion is the last layer which is come in contact with the substratum, and some of the cells of this medulla layer even can go inside this substratum to make attach them firmly. That is, inside the rock, some cells of the medulla hyphae are growing inside the rock. Whenever they find the crevices in the rocks, they start to go inside to make firmly attach these particular Crustose lichen to the rocks. So very particular about the Crustose lichen is that they shows the upper cortex, they shows the medulla, and in between the upper cortex and the medulla, what we have is the green algal cells. But the medulla is the final layer and it is directly attached to the substrate, because there is a no lower cortex, and this medulla can somewhat may extend into the crust itself. It can go into the rock to make firmly attach this particular lichen to the substrate. Now see, the surface may be smooth or warted. Okay, sometimes it the surface looks so smooth, and sometimes it also shows the warts. Okay, it looks somewhat rough, and it frequently become areolate. Very important, the thallus of the Crustose lichen. Okay, whatever the Crustose lichens are there, they show the tendency that their thallus frequently become areolate. Now, what is meant by areolate? That is, it is composed of a small separate island of the thallus. That is, if you can observe here is the cracking. Okay, and if these cracks go beyond the point, these show the small thalluses, different thalluses, not the one intact thalluses. That is, they are converted into the small separate islands of the thallus seated on the underlying prothallus. So underlying, what we have is the intact prothallus, and on this thallus they just look like this. They are the smaller thalluses or the smaller island like thalluses were created, small islands like this. So that is why this particular Crustose lichen shows the tendency to become the areolate, in which the whole thallus looks like made up of the small thalluses. They looks like island on the main prothallus. So observe in this particular picture, these are looks like a islands, small islands, which are growing on the below prothallus. Okay, below we have the intact thallus, and on this prothallus the small islands were created. So this tendency to got converted into the small separate island is called as the areolate. Okay, this property of the lichen to get areolate, that literally means they are converting into the small separate islands of the thallus. Okay, so when you talk about the Crustose lichen, what should be come to your mind first? The first thing should be come to your mind while thinking about the Crustose lichen, that they do not have lower cortex, and the final last layer they have is the medulla. Okay, the final layer, the last layer of their anatomical structure is the medulla, and this medulla directly comes in contact with the substratum, and it goes into the substratum to make firmly attach this lichen to these particular rocks, and they got the tendency to get areolate. That means the fragmentation of the thallus into the small island, and which are present on the main intact prothallus. Now see, these areoles may be clearly separate. Sometimes, see, observe this particular picture. Now below we had the prothallus, and now look at these prothallus, how they got converted into small island. Now they are we just looking at the structure, that we will say that all these prothalluses or all these islands got separated from the one another. So sometimes these areoles may got clearly separated from the one another, as you can see in this particular picture, or they can be closely contagious and often represent the breakup of the thallus surface. So it looks like this was the total whole thallus, and the breakup occurs there. And due to this breaking, there is a separation of the many islands of the Crustose lichens. All the whole thallus is got converted into the small island. Okay, so whatever the small islands are there, these are getting off from the parent thallus. Sometimes they show the clear cut separation, and sometimes they may be contagious with the one another, that is, they are loosely connected to one another. If the surface crack but not broken up into the discrete areoles. Now see, that means literally it is the structure of the prothallus, and the surface is broken out just like this. The crevices are formed like this. The surface is broken off. It shows the cracks, okay, but not totally broken off into the discrete areoles. That is, the parent thallus is got cracks in it, but it does not separate it completely into the discrete areoles. Then in such a condition, this thallus is called as the rhymose thallus. Please remember, very important term, this is called as the rhymose thallus. When we say the rhymose thallus, we say rhymose thallus when there is a cracks in the Crustose lichens but separating totally the parent thallus. And in such a condition, we say that these are thalluses shows the rhymose thallus. Like this, it will look like this. The whole thallus is there. There are cracks, but they are not separated from the one another. They are still connected. Then in such a condition, it is called as the rhymose thallus. Now sometimes what happens, the surface is covered with the powdery structure. Okay, there are so many cracks that these cracks, small cracks, looks like a powdery structure. Just you can observe in this particular picture, they looks like a powdery structure. Then in such a condition, such a thallus is called as the prunose thallus. Okay, so lichen thallus can be considered as a rhymose thallus or the prunose thallus. Rhymose thallus is when the thallus is showing the cracking but not the complete separation, and the prunose thallus is when it shows the powdery structures on its structure. Okay, so rhymose thallus and the prunose thallus, and the intact thallus, whenever there is an intact thallus, parent thallus, it is called as the prothallus. And if this prothallus shows the cracking but not the separation, it is called as the rhymose thallus. And if shows the powdery structure, it is called as the prunose thallus. Okay, so areoles may be there, they may be completely separated or they may be contagious. If they are not separated and contagious but still showing the cracks, it is rhymose thallus. And if it shows the powdery structure, then it is called as the prunose thallus. Okay, now consider the second one, that is the Squamulose lichens. Okay, now what we study about the Crustose lichen is very peculiar. You should remember this point throughout, okay, throughout the process of UPSC mains examination, because when you put forward these points about the Crustose lichen, you will definitely get the 100% marks, because these are types of peculiar points are not covered by all the students. Okay, because majority of the time we see in our test series that students don't know exactly how to differentiate between the Crustose lichen from the Foliose lichen. What they know is only that the morphologically lichens can be divided into such structures. So this is the superficial knowledge. That knowledge is the superficial knowledge. What you should be able to do is to separate the Crustose lichen completely from the other lichens, anatomically as well as from the morphology point of view. All right. Now consider the second type, that is called as the Squamulose lichen. Now these are Squamulose lichens are a little more developed than the Crustose lichen, but they are lacking behind the Fruticose lichen or the Foliose lichen. Okay, actually this is the overlapping group, and its member belongs to both to the Crustose and the Foliose lichen. Okay, because they found the squamules, and that is why they are popularly called as the Squamulose lichens. Now see, in these lichens, the thallus is composed of usually small, flat, usually meshed, often overlapping scales, okay, which are called as the squamules, and hence the name, that is the Squamulose lichen. Okay, so what will be the structure of the thallus? Thallus looks very small, plus it is flat, and it is mess up structure. Okay, it is intertwined structure like this, and overlapping scales are there one upon another like this. Overlapping scales are there, and these structures are called as the squamules because they looks like a small thallus. Because when you say the Crustose lichen, they are like this, and when we say the Squamulose lichen, they shows the very small mass. just like this, and that is why they are called famously called as the squamules, and that is why we describe these lichens as a squamulose lichen. Okay, now whatever you see in this particular picture, the lichen is called as the Placidium squamulosum. Okay, uska naam hai Placidium squamulosum, and this Placidium squamulosum belongs to the squamulose lichen because they shows the very small thalluses, flat thalluses, and often the scales are overlapping in this particular thalluses. Okay, so nearly anatomically they are same with the Crustose lichen, but squamulose like structures are there, and that is why they are considered as the squamulose lichens. Okay, now consider they differ anatomically from the Foliose lichen in that they do not have the lower cortex. Of course, if they do not have the lower cortex, they are different from the Foliose lichen, but this makes them very similar with the Crustose lichen because Crustose lichen also do not possess the lower cortex, or it is weakly differentiated. Now consider these particular words, this particular statement, because this is saying it is not particular, it is weakly differentiated. That is, if you find the thallus structure like this, the thallus is made up of the upper cortex, which is made up of the fungal cells. Then we have the algal layer. Then we have the medulla layer like this. And finally here the Crustose lichen do not show the presence of the cortex, lower cortex, but the Foliose lichen shows the presence of the lower cortex. But what Squamulose lichen shows? They do not show the clear differentiation between the medulla and the lower cortex. That means there is a portion, but it is not differentiated, and that is why you can consider the Squamulose lichen are little more advanced as compared to the Crustose lichen, but they are still lacking behind the Foliose lichen or the Fruticose lichen. So the lower cortex is absent, but it is sometimes it is weakly differentiated. So they are just a one step ahead of the Crustose lichen, but they are still lacking behind the Foliose lichen or the Fruticose lichen, because anatomically they do not show the presence of cortex, or sometimes they are just weakly differentiated through the underside, may be differently colored, okay, from rest of the medulla. That is, this portion, rest of the medulla portion is somewhat shows the differentiation, and it is a colored portion which makes them different from the medulla portion. So somewhat structures are there of the lower cortex, but it is not completely differentiated. This makes you to believe that it is more advanced than the Crustose lichen, but less advanced than the Foliose or the Fruticose lichens. And sometimes the rhizoidal hyphae may be produced. Observe this point carefully. Sometimes the rhizoidal hyphae like this, it may got produced. That literally makes you confirm that these are more advanced than the Crustose lichen, because Crustose lichen on the other hand lacks both. That is, the lower cortex is absent, plus the rhizoids are also absent in this particular Crustose lichen, but this Squamulose lichen shows some kind of differentiation. There is a subcolored portion below the medulla region, and plus sometimes some members also shows the rhizoidal hyphae, and that is why we are saying that it is more advanced as compared to the Crustose lichen, but less advanced as compared to the Fruticose and the Foliose lichen. This Squamulose lichen shows the smaller flat structures, very small flat structures, which are called squamules, and hence the name, that is Squamulose lichens. Example is the Placidium squamulosum. They are anatomically they differ from Foliose lichen because they lack the lower cortex, but sometimes it shows a little differentiation. That means the lower cortex is differentiating from this point, and sometimes they also shows the rhizoidal hyphae, which are again making them very advanced than the Crustose lichen, but still they are lacking behind from the Foliose or the Fruticose lichen. See, in some lichens, for example, Cladonia digitata. Of course, observe this particular picture. This picture belongs to the Cladonia digitata. This is the lichen, and this lichen is called as the Cladonia digitata. The squamules are relatively large. Okay, the squamules का जो size होता है, this size is relatively large as compared to the other squamules showing the squamulose lichens. So they may be several millimeters in length. Okay, several millimeter length can be there, and they may be lobe and held away from the substrate. Substrate से वो दूर भी ऐसे पहचाने जा सकते हैं. You can clearly say that they are coming out of the surface, and they are lobe, and they are away from the substrate, and they can go up to the some millimeter high length. Okay, nevertheless they remains very limited in size. Okay, so size is also the size is always the limiting factor for the squamulose lichen, because these are squamulose lichens are very short or less in size as compared to the Crustose lichen, but what they show some advanced differentiation in the form of lower cortex and the rhizini. Plus they also shows some squamules which are relatively larger in size as compared to the other squamulose lichen, and these squamules, they can come out of the surface and they can grow upward like this. Okay, just like in the example we can find the Cladonia digitata. This particular Cladonia digitata shows the presence of the squamules which are relatively large and which are coming out of the lower thallus. It is coming out of the lower thallus and they can go up to the several millimeter in length. They may be lobe and they go away from the substratum. Still, with these larger squamulose, still these squamulose lichens looks very smaller. They remain very limited in size. Okay, this characteristics is even written when they contain the larger squamules. Okay, now see, from the evolutionary point of view, the squamulose external structure may be the modification of the crustose state. Of course, we have discussed that the crustose lichen do not have the lower cortex. Plus, the crystals lichen also like the rhizoids, but the some form of lower cortex and some form of rhizine can be found in the squamulose lichen. Hence, we can say that from the evolutionary point of view, these lichens are the modifications of the crustose state and maybe the ancestral or the reduced state of the foliose lichen. See, very concrete statement that they are the ancestral forms of the foliose lichen. That is, these foliose lichen are evolved from the squamulose lichen, and the squamulose lichen in turn evolved from the crustose lichen. So the evolutionary line going like this, there is a crustose lichen, and from this crustose lichen the squamulose lichens got created, and from this squamulose lichen the foliose lichens got created. Because these squamulose lichens are somewhat advanced than the crustose lichen, but they are less developed than the foliose lichen. But these foliose lichens found their ancestry in the squamulose lichen. All these foliose lichens are arise from the squamulose lichen. So from the evolutionary point of view, the squamulose lichens are lacking behind from the going advanced from the crustose lichen, but they are still lacking behind from the foliose lichen. So from this evolutionary line, you can conclude that the squamulose lichens have their ancestry in the crustose lichen, and the foliose lichen have their ancestry in the squamulose lichen. So very important. If you understand this, you can write it down from the evolutionary viewpoint, because in your syllabus it is clearly mentioned that you have to study all these things from the evolutionary point of view. You should be able to write it down whether the crustose lichens are advanced or the lacking behind from the squamulose lichen. And on this evolutionary line, the first came is the crustose lichen, and from this crustose lichens the squamulose lichen develop, and from this squamulose lichen the foliose lichens are developed. Okay, so very important from the evolutionary point of view. You should remember all these things. Okay, now consider the third one, that is the Fruticose lichens. Okay, now see, the thallus shows the branch structures. Of course, they are advanced. They are advanced than the crustose lichen and the squamulose lichen. Okay. Squamulose lichen and crustose lichens, they are lacking behind than the Fruticose lichen, and these Fruticose lichens are very much advanced as compared to the crustose lichen and the squamulose lichen, because crustose lichen shows the very flat structure which is attached to the substratum, and the squamulose lichen shows the just a differentiation in the form of scamules. But what the Fruticose lichen shows, they shows the branch structure. Observe these particular pictures, because they are showing the branching structure. Observe this particular lichen. This one is the Ramalina and this one is the Evornia. Both these lichens shows the branching structure. They shows the branches. The branches being covered with a single cortex. Okay, single cortex उनको covered करता है. In a Fruticose lichen with the flattened branches, for example, the Ramalina. Okay, there are Fruticose lichens with flat branches. You can observe this is the Ramalina, and this shows the very flat branches like this. Okay, flat branching pattern is there. The cortex extend around both the surface of the branch. Okay, cortex it revolves around both the surface of the branch. Okay, the lower surface as well as the upper surface. You find this cortex on the both side of the branch. Okay, hence they differ from the Foliose lichen. Okay, these are Fruticose lichens still differ from the Foliose lichens with the branch aerial lobes such as the Evornia. Okay, इस Evornia से वो different लगते हैं, which are the nothing but the Foliose lichen. But these Fruticose lichen, what they show? They show the branching structure in the form of flat lines. Okay, see, flattened branches are there. Very important word. These are flattened branches are there, which shown by these Fruticose lichen. But the leafy branches are shown in the Foliose lichen. So from the evolutionary line again, remember this, we have studied the crustose lichen, then squamulose lichen. Now we are studying the Fruticose lichen. Now these Fruticose lichen are showing the branches, but the flattened branches like Ramalina. Show how these flattened branches are there. These are all the flattened branches. And in the Foliose lichen, what we find is the broad leafy branches. So you can say that on the advanced evolutionary line, the Foliose lichen stops the lichens, because these Foliose lichen showing the branches which are leafy branches. For example, Evornia, you can clearly observe here is the Evornia, and this Evornia is showing the leafy branches. While on the other hand, here is the Ramalina, which belongs to the Fruticose lichen. It is showing the flattened branches. So how to differentiate between the Fruticose lichen and the Foliose lichen is that the Fruticose lichen shows the flattened branches, while on the other hand, the Foliose lichen shows the leafy branches. The example for the Foliose lichen, which is showing the leafy branches or the aerial lobes, is called as the Evornia. While the typical example for the Fruticose lichen, which shows the flattened branches, is the Ramalina. Examples are important because without the example you cannot explain the things in the UPSC mains examination. So the Fruticose lichen shows the somewhat advanced structure as compared to Crustose lichen and the Squamulose lichen. They are advanced than the Crustose lichen and the Squamulose lichen, in that they shows the flattened branching, but they are still lacking behind than the Foliose lichen because they do not show the leafy branches like Evornia. So Ramalina is the example for the flattened branches, and these are shown by the Fruticose lichens. Okay, now consider in Usnea, which is the Fruticose lichen, the thallus is tufted from the basal holdfast. That is, they also contain the holdfast. See, this structure is not found in the Crustose lichen or the Squamulose lichen, the holdfast. Here you can observe this is the holdfast of the Usnea. As you know, in the algae, we have studied the holdfast, which is the basal area which is attaching this particular structure with the substratum. This holdfast structure is responsible for the attachment to the substratum, right? And which is got blackened in Usnea. Now clearly observe here, you will see the blackened area. This the color of these holdfast in the Usnea is the black color. So the Fruticose lichen, when we study the Fruticose lichen, they show the flat branches. Observe these branches, these are flat branches, not the leafy branches. And these are flat branches also shows the presence of holdfast, which is not found in the Crustose or the Squamulose lichens. So they are quite advanced when we compare them with the Crustose or the Squamulose lichens. But when we compare them with the Foliose lichen, they just lacking behind because they show just the simple flat branching structure. What the Foliose lichen shows? Foliose lichen shows the leafy branching. They shows the leaf-like structures. They are more advanced than this Fruticose lichen. So in the Fruticose lichen, we have the second example after the Ramalina. We have the Usnea. They shows the presence of holdfast, which was blackened at the base. Okay, the branches are round. Of course, when you cut these branches, these are round in cross sections. Okay, and with the compact medulla is there with the under cortex and the solid cartilaginous central axis. Okay, so central axis is there because there is a branching. There is the presence of central axis, and around the central axis there is a compact medulla, and plus there is a cortex. So Usnea, which is the example for the Fruticose lichen, this Fruticose lichen shows very much differentiation when we compare them with the Crustose lichen or the Squamulose lichen. Right? Now consider the fourth one, that is the Foliose lichen. Now you can consider that these are the largest and perhaps the most complex form of the lichens. So very much developed, highly developed form of the lichens comes in the form of Foliose lichen. And now why we call it Foliose lichen? Observe this particular picture. In that, this is the single thallus, and you can clearly see the leafy branches, how leafy branches are there. That is why these are famously called as the Foliose lichen. Folio literally means the leaf. Okay, so Foliose lichen, these are perhaps some of the largest. See, observe the size. These are the largest and the most complex form of the lichen, very much complex. The thallus is generally forms the flat leaf-like lobes, the very typical characteristics of the Foliose lichen, which are making it different from the Fruticose lichen. Fruticose lichen, we have the flat branches only, but here we have the flat leaf-like branches. Observe here, these are the leaf-like branches. Leaf-like lobes are there with differentiated layers of tissue anatomically. Anatomically, they have shows a very much differentiation. The upper and the lower cortex is there, forming the upper and lower surfaces. There is a presence of upper cortex, there is a presence of lower cortex. All the layers are strictly differentiated. And that is why we consider them as advanced than all the Crustose lichens, Squamulose lichens, or the Fruticose lichens. All these are lacking behind than the Foliose lichen, because Foliose lichen shows the leafy structure and they shows the clear-cut differentiation anatomically of the upper cortex and the lower cortex. And of course, they shows the presence of rhizonia in order to attach themselves to the substratum. Now see, the lobes are commonly, but not always, oppressed to the substrate surface. See, their lobes. See, observe these particular lobes. They are just oppressed from the substrate. That is, they are not completely flat and attached to the ground. They are little bit uplifted. See, observe this particular. This is the uplifted, not attached to the ground completely. And these lobes, which are leaf-like lobes, these leaf-like lobes somewhat got oppressed from the substrate surface. So they are not completely attached to the substrate. Now this is very peculiar because in the Crystose lichen, the whole body, the whole thallus structure is got attached to the substratum. But the leafy Foliose lichens, these leafy leaf-like lobes are coming above the substrate surface, but they can be lifted away, right? They can be lifted away, and the lower cortex is differently colored. Okay, what they show, they show the different colored lower cortex. That is the complete differentiation of the cortex is found in these Foliose lichen. That means the complete advancement occurs in these Foliose lichens when we compare them to the Crustose lichen, Squamulose lichen, and the Fruticose lichen. So right from the beginning, from the Crustose lichen, we are studying how they are evolving from the evolutionary point of view, how the new structures are attaching to these particular lichens. So they shows the complete differentiation of the upper cortex and lower cortex, and they are frequently brown or black. Which color are they? They show the frequently brown or black coloration there because they are colored. The lower cortex shows the brown or black color, and they usually bear the rhizines. Okay, rhizines are present in order to attach to the substratum. For example, see is the Peltigera. What you see in the particular picture is the Peltigera. Now see, this is very important. Whenever you describe any type of lichen, Crustose lichen, whether it is Squamulose, whether it is the Foliose or the Fruticose lichen, you should be able to give the example. Okay, so this belongs to the Peltigera, and the Folicose lichen shows the flat leafy like lobes, and these lobes are uplifted from the ground, and they show the clear differentiation of the upper cortex and the lower cortex, and the lower cortex is generally colored into the brown and black color, and they also shows the presence of rhizines. Okay, whatever the rhizines are there which are used to attach themselves to the substratum. Okay, now consider the Foliose lichen with the multiple branches of the thallus may stand away from the substrate. Of course, they got this remarkable ability. Observe this particular picture. You will see this like this is like a large plant. Like it looks like a large plant because the branches are coming out of the substratum. They are not attached to the substratum. What they use for the attaching to the substratum is the rhizines. And the very much differentiated lower cortex distinguishes them from the Fruticose lichen. The differentiated lower cortex distinguish them from the Fruticose lichen. So how to differentiate between the Fruticose lichen and the Foliose lichen? That just shows the clear-cut differentiation of the lower cortex. So the lower cortex is clearly differentiated, and plus the Foliose lichen shows the typical characteristic of uplifting their leafy lobes from the ground and just attaching to the ground by using the rhizine only. So this taking them literally towards the bryophytes. Some bryophytes are like this. They show the rhizoids and their complete whole body is above the ground. So these are Folicose lichen. We can compare them with the bryophyte now. So from the evolutionary viewpoint, what we have studied is the Crustose lichen, then the Squamulose lichen, then the Fruticose lichen, and then the Foliose lichen. So Foliose lichens are the most advanced, and from this state we can compare there with the bryophytes or the algae. Okay, उनको हम bryophyte के साथ यहाँ से compare कर सकते हैं, and on this evolutionary line you should be able to write it down everything relating with this evolution of this particular lichens, that how the Crustose lichen got converted into Squamulose lichen, Squamulose lichen got converted into the Fruticose lichen, and Fruticose lichen got converted into the Foliose lichen. And in a very similar way, Foliose lichen shows the ancestry in the Fruticose lichen, Fruticose lichen shows the ancestry in the Squamulose lichen, and Squamulose lichen shows the ancestry in the Crustose lichen. So this is how you should be able to understand, and you should be able to compare this, all four. Okay, now see, anatomically the Foliose lichen has both upper and lower cortex. Of course, they are highly developed and they contain both type of cortex, very much differentiated upper cortex and the lower cortex. The photobiont layer is in the upper part of the medulla. Of course, this is similar in all kind of the lichen, that the upper part of the medulla contains the photobiont cell. That is, consider this is the thallus, and here we have the upper cortex, then we have the photobiont cell, then we have the medulla, and then finally we have the lower cortex. So in this particular upper medulla portion, they find the photobiont cell. Okay, where the argal cells receive the enough light. Okay, where they receive the very much enough light, and yet they are protected from the intense sunlight from the upper cortex. So this upper cortex is protecting them from the intense sunlight, but they are still receiving some moderate light in order to perform the photosynthesis. So the clear-cut differentiation, very well developed upper body, very well developed rhizine, and by using the rhizine there is a uplifting of the particular folio leaf-like lobes above the ground, and all these are doing the photosynthesis in a very advanced way. So the Foliose lichen can be considered as the most advanced lichen when we compare them with the all other three lichens. Okay, now consider. Now next is the Filamentous lichen. Now see, these are the very different lichens. but still we have to study them because they shows those very peculiar characteristics. Now observe this in this particular diagram. What you are seeing is the filamentous lichen. Okay. Now see, in these lichens, the fungal hyphae forms the sheath around the filamentous alga. Okay, whatever the filamentous alga is there, now you know what the filamentous alga, this structure is shown by the cyanobacteria. Okay, now carefully observe this point. Now cyanobacteria shows the filamentous structure, and in that somewhere they has the heterocyst, right, and they shows the gelatinous sheath around it, right, like this, and then other cells are the vegetative cells, or some of them may be the akinets. So this is the structure of the cyanobacteria. Now what the fungi do here, they form the sheath around the algal structure. Now very important to understand, observe this. They form sheath like this around this algal structure. So see the shape becomes filamentous, and that is why these fungi, these lichens are famously called as the filamentous lichen. Now how this created? Now consider once again, this is an heterocyst, the larger cell. Then we have the vegetative cells. This is the structure of typical cyanobacteria. We have studied the cyanobacteria in very detail, right? Now around the vegetative cell there is a presence of sheath, right? Gelatinous sheath. We have discussed this gelatinous sheath in very detail while we are studying the cyanobacteria. Now this is the typical structure of the cyanobacteria. Now around this cyanobacteria, what the fungal hyphae do? They form the sheath around this cyanobacteria. Now it is the fungal sheath which is coming around the cyanobacteria. Now see the shape. Now clearly observe the shape. This shape is the filamentous shape. And that is why this type of lichens are called as the filamentous lichen, because the outer portion is made up of the fungi, while the inner portion is made up of the cyanobacteria, and they are forming the structure which is literally filamentous, and that is why we are calling these lichens as a filamentous lichen. Okay. Now these lichens shows the growth form like the mass of thin, stringy, non-branching hairs. Of course, it looks like a hair, a non-branching hair. Okay, or filaments. Each filament look like a hair, and that is why we call them as a non-branching hairs. Very important to explain this particular lichens is the term non-branching hairs. So there are no branching, but it looks like a hairs, and that is why we call them as a filamentous lichen. And it contains the cyanolichens. Okay, now when we use the term cyanolichens, that means the lichens which are formed by using the cyanobacteria. Here is the combination of fungi plus the cyanobacteria, and not the algae. Okay, so fungi and the cyanobacteria, when it come together, they form the filamentous lichens. Very important. Okay, now consider, unlike most other lichen, the filaments of the fungi do not determine the shape of lichen. Very important. See, who is deciding the shape of the lichen here? The deciding factor is the cyanobacteria, because cyanobacteria shows the filamentous structure, and around this cyanobacteria the fungi grow, and that is why it becomes the filamentous. So fungi is not determining the shape of these lichens. Who is determining the shape? Shape is determined by the cyanobacteria. This is very contrasting, because in the Crustose lichen, Squamulose lichen, Foliose lichen, or the Fruticose lichen, the structure is majority of the time is defined by the fungi. Fungi is deciding the structure, which type of structure is going to happen there. But in the filamentous lichen, who is deciding the shape? Is the cyanobacteria and not the fungi. Okay, so it is unlike the other bacteria. It is unlike the other fungi. The filaments of the fungi do not determine the shape of the lichen. In this case, who is deciding? Is the cyanobacteria. Okay, now the filamentous lichens may look like a black hair. You can observe in this particular picture, they look like a black hairs. Small black hairs are there, and they are forming the filaments, and these are filaments are coming together, then such a structure is formed. The example for this is the Cystocoilus ebeneus. ठीक है, Cystocoilus ebeneus जो है इस filamentous lichen का क्या है, एग्जाम्पल है. ऑलराइट. Now we are going to study the reproductive structures which are found in these particular lichens. For this, we have already discussed some of the points in the introductory lecture. In that, we have studied some of the vegetative way of reproduction, or sexual way of reproduction, and the sexual way of reproduction. Okay. Now, see, both the types of the reproduction, that is the sexual as well as the vegetative reproduction, can be found amongst the members of the lichens. That is, lichens can be divided by using the vegetative method, such as the fragmentation or sexual spores. Plus, there is a sexual way of reproduction also there. Now, while studying the reproduction in the lichen, one thing you should be carefully remember, that the lichens are made up of at least two organisms. Okay. Now, so the reproductive strategies are very different from rest of the plant kingdom. ठीक है, जो rest of the plant kingdom है उससे these reproductive strategies are quite different when we compare them with the other plant-like organisms. So you should be able to distinguish how the sexual reproduction takes place in the fungi, in the lichens, when we talk about the individual reproduction in the fungi and the algae. As you know, we have largely studied how the fungi reproduce in the first unit and how the algae reproduce, right? We have studied this. But when these combine together, that is the fungi plus algae, and there is occurrence of the sexual reproduction, how this sexual reproduction takes place. This is very peculiar for the lichen, because you have to differentiate between the reproduction of the fungi and reproduction of the algae. So that you should be able to write it down. What is the reproductive strategies in the lichens? You should not overlap the things from the fungi or the algae in this particular answer. Okay, now see, they can be reproduced by the sexual methods or the vegetative methods. Okay, now consider the vegetative reproduction. The relevant structures are far less obvious. See, in the vegetative reproduction, when you talk about the vegetative reproduction in the lichen, this vegetative reproduction do not show any type of particular structure, that such and such a structures will form and then this structure will grow into the individual thalli. This does not happen. No particular type of structure is formed in these lichens to reproduce vegetatively. They don't show any definite structure. Okay, there is no definite structure for the sexual. There is no definite structure for the vegetative reproduction. There is just a modification of the thallus morphology. Whatever the thallus is already present there, the morphology of this thallus is somewhat got different. Just a modification occurs in this particular thallus, and then there is a vegetative reproduction, right? Some types of the vegetative propagules possess no structures to help to produce and disperse such a propagules. So whatever the propagules which are created during the particular vegetative reproduction, they do not show any type of structure which are helping them to produce or to disperse into the environment. That literally means in the lichens, when we talk about the vegetative reproduction, they do not show any particular structural feature for the vegetative reproduction, because in higher plants we find the particular structures are there which reproduces vegetatively. But in the lichens, the vegetative reproduction is taking place by their parent thallus. No special structures were produced. Just the modification of a parent thallus is there, and this modification of parent thallus serves as a structure for the vegetative reproduction. And also they do not have any type of structure which can disperse these particular propagules to go into the new habitat and create a new thallus. So we can say that the vegetative reproduction in these lichens is far less developed. They do not show any type of particular structure for the vegetative reproduction. Now see, many lichen will produce the new individual from the fragments. Okay, just the fragment of the parent lichen, it got off from the parent plant, and this fragment then grow into the new individual. This is how it happens, vegetative reproduction in the lichens. That is, the fragments are created, no special structure. These fragments are coming from the parent thallus itself, that break off from the thallus. So consider this is the parent thallus, and from this one portion is got broke off, and this fragment is got created into the new thalli, new lichen. And then in such a case, it is called as the vegetative reproduction. Generally, this fragment which is coming out from the parent thallus, it contains both the mycoband and photoband cell. Both the cells are there. Fungal cells are there, that is the mycoband cells are there, and photoband cells, that is the algal cell or the cyanobacterial cells, are also there. And that is why these fragments can completely convert into the new thalli, just forming the new lichens. Okay, and it involves no special structure. There are no special structure, just the fragment of the parent thallus. And for example, this fragment of the parent thallus got separate from the parent thalli, and it contains both the cells from the fungus and the algae, and they grow into the new thalli. This is how it occurs, simply by the fragmentation, the vegetative reproduction in these lichens. See, the species that grow on the trees can often be torn easily by the strong winds or the blonde debris. Okay, whatever the lichens which are growing on the trees, observe this particular lichen, it is growing on this tree branch, and whenever there is a strong wind, these lichens tends to break off. They break off their aerial parts. And all these break up aerial parts, they landed on the particular habitat, and when they land on this particular habitat, they grow into the new thalli. This is how the fragmentation occurs, by using the wind. So whatever the thalluses of the lichens which are attached to the trees, and whenever there is a strong wind, these thallus got broke off. The fragments were created, and these fragments then later got converted into the new individual lichens, and this is how they reproduce vegetatively. This is how they create the vegetative forms. Okay, so the exact copy of the parent is created. Now see, most of the significant vegetative propagules are the Ecidia and the soradia. Okay, so when we talk about the vegetative propagules, there is a formation of some of the structures in the asexual reproduction, that is the Ecidia and the soradia. Both these structures are not the sexual structure, but these are the asexual structures. Okay, both these structures are the asexual structures, and these asexual structures are known as the Ecidia and the soradia. Okay, the former, that is the Ecidia, we are talking about this Ecidia. The former are the small outgrowths of the thallus. Okay, from the thallus, consider this is an thallus, and the small outgrowth of this thallus are called as the Ecidia, up to the millimeter in length, just the millimeter in length, which contains the fungal hyphae and photoband cell. It contains not only the fungal hyphae, but it also contains the photoband cells, and then it is blown off from the by using the wind. Okay, broken off Ecidia may be transported by the wind, water, or animals. So these Ecidia, when broken off, these Ecidia can be taken up by the wind, it can be taken up by the water, or it can be taken up by the animals to the other places. And if it is deposited to the suitable habitat, then they may generate into the new thalli. If they find the suitable environment, they can grow into the new thalli as well. Okay, new thallus was created. So the Ecidia and soradia, the non-sexual structures, were formed in this particular lichens, and these Ecidia are nothing but the small fragments, small outgrowths of the thallus. These small outgrowths of the thallus contain both the cells, the fungal cell as well as the algal cell. So algal cell and the fungal cells containing both these Ecidia, when broken off from the parent plant, these are taken up by the wind, water, or animal to the other places. And if they find the suitable habitat for themselves, if they find the optimum atmospheric condition, they can grow into the new thalli. Okay, so this is how the non-sexual structure Ecidia able to create the new lichens. Okay, so this is all about the Ecidia. Now consider the second one. The soradia looks like the small powdery granules. Okay, powder like structure. Observe in this particular structure, here is the powdery granules are created in this particular lichens. So these powdery granules are called as the soradia. Generally they are between the 20 to 100 mm. Okay, generally larger than the Ecidia, and these are 20 to 100 mm in length. Okay, now see, each soradium consists of the few photoband cells surrounded by the fungal cells. Okay, so whatever the powdery granules are created there, these powdery granules, which are called as soradia, contains the fungal cell as well as the algal cell. Fungal cells and as algal cells are there, so the complete lichen is there, and these soradia are easily dispersed by the wind, water, or animal again. So abiotic factor or the biotic factor plays a very important role for transporting these asexual structures from one place to another place, and if they find the suitable habitat again, these soradia can grow into the new thalli. So Ecidia and soradia, very very important terms in the lichen reproduction. The asexual structures, Ecidia and soradia, were formed in the lichen, and these asexual structures are responsible for creating the new lichen, and Ecidia are smaller as compared to soradia. And Ecidia, whether it is the Ecidia and the soradia, both are taken up by the wind, water, and the animals. Okay, the transporting mechanism is both by the abiotic factors like wind and water, and as well as the biotic factor like animals. Both the factors are responsible for transporting this Ecidia and the soradia, and whenever they find the new habitat, a good habitat for the survival, they quickly start to germinate. And remember, most important, that whether it's the Ecidia, whether it's the soradia, both contains the mycobiont and the photobiont cell, and that is why they are complete lichen in itself. Okay, वो खुद ही एक complete lichen है, and that is why they can easily grow into the new habitat. Okay, now see, no lichen is individual organism, but it is the association of two or more organisms. Okay, now we are coming to the sexual reproduction, and in the sexual reproduction you have to understand one point very peculiarly. Okay, so please concentrate on this particular point. Okay, when we studied the lichen, we at the very first lecture we discussed that the lichens are not made up of the one organism, but they are at least made up of the two organisms. Sometimes there may be the three organisms. So there can be the fungi plus algae, or then can be the fungi plus cyanobacteria, plus there can be the fungi plus cyanobacteria plus algae. So at least there are two organisms, and maximally there can be the three organisms as well. So when we talk about sexual reproduction, whether we are talking about the sexual reproduction of the fungi, or the sexual reproduction of the algae, or the sexual reproduction of the cyanobacteria, or the sexual reproduction of the lichen, this is the interesting point. See, in fact, in the lichens, only the fungal partners may reproduce sexually. Whatever the sexual reproduction is occurring in the lichen is only about the fungal partner and not the algal or the cyanobacterial partner. So the fungi is only reproducing sexually in the lichen. The whole lichen cannot be reproduced sexually. Only the fungal part of the lichen reproduce sexually. That is why we have to correct this statement. Hence, to say that the lichens reproduce sexually, it can be corrected as the fungal partner within the lichen. The fungal partner within the lichen may reproduce sexually. So in the sexual reproduction in the lichen, when we talk about the sexual reproduction in the lichens, who is reproducing? Only the fungi, not the algal partner, not the photobiont partner. Only fungi is reproducing sexually, not the other partners in the lichen. Very, very important. Okay, because in the UPSC mains examination, when you write about the sexual reproduction, you should strictly mention that whenever we talk about the sexual reproduction in the lichen, who is reproducing sexually is only the fungal partner and not the photobiont partner, not the photosynthetic partner. Okay, now consider a number of photobiont species found in the lichen can be found free living. So what about the photobiont cell? How they reproduce sexually? Because all these photobiont cell which are found in the lichen, in the nature, they are also free living. Okay, just like say nostoc forming the lichen, these nostoc also live freely. They also are free living. These nostocs found in the nature as a free living organism, and they also form the lichen. Similar is the case for the other algae as well. All algae are forming the majority of the chlorophyceae members are forming the lichen, but majority of these chlorophyceae members are also the free living algae. So they could reproduce sexually, but within the lichens, the sexual reproduction of the photobiont is suppressed. So whenever they are free living, these algae or the cyanobacteria, whenever they are free living, they can reproduce sexually, freely. Okay, when they are free living, they are not in a combination with the fungi to form the lichen. But whenever they are in the symbiotic association with the fungi to form the lichen, their sexual way of reproduction is suppressed. So photobiont is not reproducing sexually in the lichens. Lichens does not reproduce sexually by using the algae or the cyanobacteria. What is sexually reproducing in the lichen is only the fungi. Fungi is reproducing sexually only. Okay, so we have to talk about the fungi. When we talk about the sexual reproduction in the lichen, we are actually discussing the sexual reproduction in the fungi. See, the sexually reproducing lichen are either ascomycetes or basidiomycetes. Of course, the fungi belongs to the ascomycetes or basidiomycetes are the main fungi which form the lichens. Now, ascomycetes produce their sexual spores called as the ascospores. Okay, so if the fungal partner belongs to the ascomycetes, it produces the sexual spores which are called as the ascospores, and these ascospores are produced in the special microscopic structure which is called as the ascae. These structures are called as ascae, and whenever there is a basidiomycete member in the lichen, it will produce the sexual spores which are called as the basidiospores. What they are creating basidiospores, and these basidiospores are produced in the microscopic structure which is called as the basidia. Okay, what structure is created there? It created the basidia. So fungal partner, at the very introductory lectures in the lichens, we are talking about that the fungal partner is either coming from the ascomycetes or the basidiomycetes, and majority of the time it is coming from the ascomycetes. Now, if in the lichen the fungal partner is belongs to the ascomycetes, then it will produce the ascospore, and in the special structure is called ascae. And if it belongs to the basidiomycete, it will produce the basidiospores in the special structure called as the basidia. Okay, so depending upon the fungal partner from where it is coming, if it is ascospore, they will if it is ascomycete, it will produce ascospore. If it is basidiomycete, it will produce the basidiospore. If it is ascospore, it will produce the ascae. Ascospore in the ascae, and if it is a basidiospore, it will produce the basidiospores in the basidia. Okay, now consider. Now, the most commonly seen ascospore producing structures are the apothecia. Very important, this should be written down in the sexual reproduction. Apothecia are created on these particular lichens, and in these lichens, the ascospores, in these particular lichens, in the apothecia is created, and on this apothecia, the ascospore or ascae is created. Okay, which is a typically disc-like to cup-like and found growing from the thallus surface. Okay, thallus के surface पे जो है, these are growing, and these structures called as the apothecia, and in these apothecia, all these ascospores are created. Okay, now see, if the new thalli are to be formed, see, very important. Now we are seeing that the asexual reproduction is only happening in the fungi, and what they are creating ascospores if the fungal partner belongs to the ascomycete. Okay, so ascospores are created. Now see, the ascospores is the typical fungi, right? This is the fungal spores, and if they germinate, they will create only the fungi. How they will create the lichen thalli? These are sexual spores which are found in the lichens. If these ascospores are the basidiospores, if they germinate alone, they will create the new fungi. They will not create the lichen, right? Because whether it is the ascospores or the basidiospores, both these are the fungal spores. They do not contain the photobiont cells. Now, when these basidiospores or the ascospores germinate independently, they will form the fungi. In order to form the new thalli of the lichen, then these spores must capture the appropriate photobiont. ये जो स्पोर्स होते हैं, these spores must be come in a contact with the appropriate photobiont in order to form the new lichen, and then and only then the sexual reproduction takes place in these particular lichens. Now these ascospores and basidiospores has to find the suitable photobiont in order to create the new lichen. There are various ways in which the sexual spores meet the right kind of photobiont. Okay, right kind of photobiont से वो कैसे मिलेंगे? For that the various types of ways are there. Let us consider one of them. Okay, now see. In a few species, the photobiont cells do occur on the apothecia. Now, apothecia is that structure on which these ascospores are created. Okay, so photobiont cells are also present on this apothecia, and the ascospores, when released, इस अपोथेसिया से जैसे ही अस्कोस्पोर्स रिलीज होते हैं, as these ascospores are released from this apothecia, at the very same time the photobiont cells can also be picked up by these ascospores. The photobiont cells along with the ascospores also liberated at the same time. So these ascospores capture this photobiont cell and quickly germinate to create the new thalli. May pick up some of the photobiont cells, right? In such an event, both the fungal and the photobiont partners are dispersed together. That is, while dispersing from the parent thallus from the apothecia structure, some of the photobiont cells are also carried by these ascospores and they got germinated into the new thalli. So this is how the sexual reproduction takes place in the lichen. In the lichen, actually, the sexual reproduction only occurring in the fungi, but they are just taking the some of the photobiont cells with them, and when they germinate, they engulf these particular algal cells and they create the new thalli. And how this fungal hyphae engulf the algal cells, we have discussed this in the introductory lecture, and how they form hyphae around these cells. This is like whenever the ascospores germinate and they form the hypha, the neighboring photobiont cells are captured by these hypha and they got engulfed in these hyphae, and this is how the new thallus lichen is created. The thallus of the lichen is got created. So this is how the vegetative reproduction, the asexual reproduction, and the sexual reproduction takes place in the lichen. In the reproductive ways, we have studied the vegetative reproduction. In that, primarily we studied the fragmentation. When we talk about the asexual spore, the isidia and the soradia are there, very interesting structures, right? And then when we talk about the sexual reproduction, the fungi is alone reproducing sexually, but it has to take some of the photobiont cells with it so that it can germinate on this photobiont cell and it can engulf it and it can form the new lichen. So this is how the reproduction takes place in the lichen. So this is all about the structure and reproduction in the lichens. Okay, so thank you very much for being with me. So this is all about this topic. Okay, thank you very much for watching this video. Please like this video, share this video with your friends who are studying the botany, and if you haven't subscribed to the Botany channel yet, please subscribe to the Botany channel for UPSC examination. Again, thank you very much for giving your time. See you in the next video lecture. Thank you.